Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time we're going way back to 1917, to the U.S. entry into World War I. We've got a ton of great sources to dig into, like firsthand accounts and analyses to really get a feel for what was going on.
Yeah, this period was a real turning point for the US, went from mostly staying out of international conflicts to being a major player on the world stage, and all in a pretty short amount of time.
And it wasn't exactly a clear-cut decision either. Our sources really paint a picture of the pressure on President Wilson back then. I mean, you had German U-boats attacking U.S. ships, the whole Zimmermann telegram thing causing public outcry. Even his own cabinet was divided on how to respond.
Oh, the Zimmermann telegram, what a mess that was. Germany trying to get Mexico to side against the US, it's no wonder people were furious and wanted war. But Wilson, he really wanted to keep things peaceful. He truly believed in diplomacy.
So if Wilson was so against war, what changed? What ultimately made him go that route?
Well, there were a few things happening at once. The telegram definitely got people riled up. But Wilson was also thinking about the bigger picture. He was really worried about Russia falling apart after the Tsar was overthrown.
Right, because Russia was a major allied power. If they collapsed, wouldn't that have helped Germany and dragged the war out even longer?
Exactly. And Wilson was an idealist, truly believed in peace through diplomacy and cooperation. The thought of America getting pulled into such a long, bloody war really bothered him.
And this struggle he had, it really comes through in our source, describing a cabinet meeting. His advisors are all pushing for war, but Wilson's pushing back, almost begging them to think about the consequences, maybe find another way.
Yeah, it shows a lot about Wilson. He wasn't just anti-war, he was a leader trying to make the best choice in a really tough spot. He knew war should only be the last resort, not something you jump into lightly.
But things were tense. Protests all over the country, some for war, some totally against it, almost like the whole country was mirroring Wilson's internal debate.
Oh, absolutely. The country was split. We've even got a source describing a fight between a pro-war senator, Henry Cabot Lodge, and a pacifist, Alexander Banwart. Really shows how strong the feelings were on both sides.
So it wasn't just a simple good versus evil thing. There were good points made by both sides. What about the folks against the war? Were they just opposed on moral grounds, or did they have strategic concerns too?
Well, there are all kinds of people against it. Take Senator Robert La Follette from Wisconsin. He was very outspoken against U.S. involvement, thought the whole thing was just a European power struggle, and American lives would be wasted for someone else's gain.
You know, La Follette's arguments really challenged the idea of a united America marching off to war. He spoke for a lot of people who were afraid of getting mixed up in European problems.
Yeah, and his reasons weren't just about staying out of it. He also questioned if the Allies were even that committed to democracy themselves. He pointed out that countries like Britain and Japan, they weren't exactly shining examples of it. Makes you really think about that whole good versus evil narrative, doesn't it?
He also predicted huge losses, which sadly turned out to be true, both on the battlefields and among civilians. His warnings about the human cost really hit home for a lot of Americans who already had loved ones lost in Europe.
It's a good reminder that war is never simple, never clean. Sending young people off to fight has huge consequences. La Follette's voice was an important counterpoint to all that glorification of war you often hear.
So even with all this opposition, Wilson went ahead and asked for a declaration of war. What was the deciding factor? Was it just German aggression, or were other things pushing him toward that decision?
It was a lot of things coming together. The attacks, the telegram, the fear of Germany winning, it all added up. But there was one more big thing. The Tsar's government in Russia fell, and a new one popped up, one that seemed to be pro-democracy.
And that change in Russia, that must have affected Wilson a lot. He'd always said the war was about democracy fighting against tyranny, so supporting a democratic Russia probably made him more willing to step in.
Exactly. Now the war could be seen as a fight for democracy, like Wilson had always talked about. It helped him convince more Americans that it was the right thing to do.
Wow, so what was happening in Russia, half a world away, actually changed American decision-making. But then came the hard part. The U.S. military wasn't ready for a war like this at all.
Oh, not at all. Compared to the huge armies in Europe, the U.S. Army was tiny. Think about it. When war was declared, they only had about 133,000 soldiers. That's nothing compared to the millions Britain, France, and Germany had. Talk about a challenge, turning a small peacetime army into a fighting force ready for a global war.
So they had to find and train millions of new soldiers, but also get them up-to-date equipment and figure out how to fight this new kind of war.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the numbers and the weapons. They had no idea what fighting in Europe was actually like. It was a whole new way of war. Trenches, machine guns, poison gas, airplanes, everything had changed.
That's a lot to learn, and fast. Where did they even start?
Well, first things first, they needed more men, and quick. They passed the Selective Service Act in May 1917. This basically started the draft. The government could now make young men join the military. It was controversial, but they needed soldiers fast.
So suddenly the country had to decide what was more important, individual freedom or national security. Were there a lot of people against this new power the government had?
Oh, definitely. Pacifist groups, people concerned about civil liberties, they said the draft was wrong, that it took away individual rights and gave the government too much power. But because it was wartime, those concerns got pushed aside.
It seems like the war changed America even before any soldiers went to Europe. It made people rethink old beliefs, and it forced them to talk about the role of government and how much freedom individuals should give up.
That's exactly right. And while all this was happening, a wave of patriotism swept through the country. Tons of young men volunteered. They wanted to do their part.
But patriotism alone doesn't create soldiers, let alone prepare them for war. Our sources show how hard it was for the U.S. to get ready for a global conflict. I mean, everything from making uniforms and guns to figuring out transportation and supplies.
Yeah, it was a huge logistical undertaking. The whole country had to change what it was doing. Factories that used to make everyday things switched to making weapons, uniforms, and whatever else the military needed.
And with so many men being drafted, that meant a lot of jobs opened up. How did they deal with that?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. The war created a ton of jobs, especially in factories up north. And at the same time, African Americans were facing terrible racism down south. So you have this huge movement of people, what's called the Great Migration, with hundreds of thousands of African Americans heading north for better jobs and a chance to escape Jim Crow.
So the war accidentally caused this huge population shift that changed the country socially and economically. It just goes to show that even a war fought overseas can have a big impact back home.
Absolutely. And these shifts weren't always smooth either. Having all these African Americans come north created tension, competition for jobs, even violence sometimes, sadly.
It reminds us that even when the country feels united, problems like inequality and prejudice don't just disappear. But let's not forget the women, too. With so many men gone, women stepped up and did jobs that were usually done by men.
Right. Women worked in factories, shipyards, even government offices. They kept things running while the men were away, showing what they were capable of and changing those old ideas about what women could and couldn't do.
It's amazing to think about all this happening back home while those troops were getting ready to sail across the Atlantic. What must it have been like for those young men, so many of them never even been away from home, suddenly going off to this huge war?
It must have been a roller coaster of emotions. Excited, scared, patriotic, and probably not really knowing what they were getting into.
Our sources describe those departures, the tearful goodbyes, the patriotic send-offs. All those families wondering what would happen. They were heading into the unknown, a journey that would change their lives forever and change the world along with them.
And when those American troops got to Europe, what they found was way different than what they expected. All those ideas about heroism and glory, they kind of went out the window when they saw what trench warfare was really like.
Yeah, the fighting was on a scale they'd never seen, and it was brutal. They were stepping into war that had already been going on for years, a war where nobody was winning, just stuck in a bloody mess.
Imagine a place just totally destroyed by bombs, trenches going on for miles, and the feeling that you could die at any second.
It's crazy. Some of our sources describe the trenches like a nightmare. Mud, blood, disease everywhere. And then the mental strain of the shelling, the snipers, it must have been awful.
And that's where they sent those American troops, often without the right training or equipment, just thrown into it.
It's hard to imagine how much courage it took to face that every day, knowing any minute could be your last.
There's this one story really gets to me. This young soldier, scared out of his mind, but he just had to see what was on the other side, risked his life to peek over the edge just for a glimpse of no man's land.
Wow, that image really captures what it was like. These were just kids, many of them, never even been away from home, and now they're in this hellish place.
Yeah.
But they had to learn, had to fight, had to survive.
And don't forget about the leadership side of it. General Pershing, the guy in charge of the American troops, he had to figure out how to work with the Allies, how to fit the Americans into their war effort. And that wasn't easy.
Yeah, Pershing was a tough one. He wanted the U.S. to do things their way, even though they needed the Allies' help. He thought American troops should only answer to American commanders, and that the U.S. should have a big say in how the whole war was run.
And part of why he wanted to do things differently was because he didn't trust the way the Allies had been fighting, especially that attritional warfare, just throwing men at the enemy and taking huge losses. Like what happened at the Somme and Passchendaele, those were horrific.
He didn't want American lives wasted in attacks that weren't going anywhere. He wanted to be more mobile, more aggressive, use American strengths to break that stalemate.
But the Allied commanders, they weren't too happy about that. They'd been fighting for years, they had their own ways of doing things, and here comes Pershing wanting to change everything.
It's understandable, right? From their point of view, Pershing probably seemed arrogant, like he didn't want to cooperate, but he was trying to protect American lives and make sure their involvement actually made a difference.
It was a tough balancing act for sure, trying to work with the Allies while also looking out for America's interests. And then things got even more complicated because of what was happening over in Russia.
Right. When Russia pulled out of the war at the end of 1917, that freed up a lot of German soldiers to focus on the Western Front. Suddenly, the Allies were in trouble. They had to do something to stop Germany from winning.
And that put even more pressure on Pershing. What was he going to do? Send Americans into the fight to help the Allies or keep them back, save their strength for later? Tough call.
A decision with huge consequences, yeah. What made him decide?
Well, a few things. The Germans launched this big surprise attack in the spring of 1918, the Spring Offensive. They almost broke through the Allied lines. It was a close one. Pershing saw how bad it was and agreed to send American troops to help stop the Germans.
But he was smart about it. He focused on defending important places and still kept the U.S. forces mostly independent. There was even a moment where they asked him to let Paris fall so they could shorten the Allied lines, and he refused. He was determined to keep American strength and make sure they played a major role in winning the war.
And that decision turned out to be really important. American troops helped stop the Germans, especially in battles like Billowood, Chateau-Thierry, and the Second Battle of the Marne. A lot of men died on both sides, but those battles were a turning point.
Those were the first big battles for the Americans, and they proved themselves, fought bravely against a tough enemy. The German attack was stopped, and things started looking up for the Allies.
Seeing the Americans succeed like that gave everyone a boost, the Allies and the Americans themselves. It showed that the U.S. was a real force to be reckoned with, but the war was far from over.
Yeah, the fighting went on, brutal as ever, and the Americans got pulled deeper into that trench warfare, facing all the same horrors, the same challenges, the same toll on their minds.
Our sources talk about the awful conditions in the trenches, the constant shelling, the fear of gas attacks. Seeing so much death and destruction, it must have been incredibly hard to deal with. These were young guys a long way from home, seeing things nobody should ever have to see.
And even in all that darkness, there were moments of bravery and kindness. One story tells about an American soldier who risked his own life to save a wounded German soldier out in no man's land. Shows that even in war, people can still be human to each other.
Those stories are important. They remind us that war isn't just about strategy and winning, it's about people. People fighting, people suffering.
And as the war went on, I bet a lot of those soldiers started wondering what they were even fighting for. The reality on the ground must have been very different from the stories they heard back home.
Oh, definitely. Back home, the propaganda machine was going full blast. They painted the war as this noble fight for democracy and freedom. But the reality in the trenches was way more complicated, way more messy. Seeing their friends die, facing death themselves, it must have made them question everything they thought they knew about the war.
And as the war got closer to the end, with the Allies looking like they were going to win, a new question came up. What was the U.S. going to do after the war?
That's where Wilson's big idea for a new world order comes in. He thought the war was a chance to build a lasting peace, based on countries working together and having the right to decide their own futures. No more secret deals, no more empires grabbing land, no more barriers to trade, all the things he thought caused the war in the first place.
That was his famous 14-point speech, right? Back in January 1918. Pretty radical for its time, trying to change how countries interacted with each other. Really shows how idealistic Wilson was, how much he believes in diplomacy.
But not everyone loved his ideas. Some thought they were great, others thought they were naive, wouldn't work in the real world.
Yeah, the European leaders weren't so sure. They had their own plans, wanted to punish Germany, take territory. They weren't as interested in Wilson's big dream of a peaceful world. They were still stuck in the old ways of doing things, with power and control.
And that's what's so interesting. Even though they won the war, you can see the seeds of future conflict being planted right there. All those different ideas about what should happen next, it led to tensions, disappointments, and that would shape the whole 20th century.
It's like the end of World War I wasn't really an ending. It was just the start of something new, with a whole new set of problems. And for the U.S., It meant they couldn't just stay out of world affairs anymore. They were a global power now, whether they liked it or not. And that role would just keep getting bigger and bigger in the years to come. It's amazing how much the U.S. changed during that war. Started out wanting to stay out of it and ended up being a major world power, influencing how the war ended and what happened afterward.
And it wasn't just overseas that things changed. Back home, while the soldiers were fighting, the whole war effort was causing big social and economic changes.
Right. We talked about the Great Migration, African Americans moving north, women taking on new roles with the men gone. But some of our sources also talk about this darker side to all that patriotism.
Yeah, you mean the American Protective League, that
Wow.
vigilante group that popped up because everyone was so afraid of spies and sabotage.
Exactly. Kind of scary how quickly things like that can happen. Wartime makes people afraid, and sometimes they turn on each other. The APL, they basically had the government's blessing to target anyone they thought was un-American, especially German immigrants and people who opposed the war.
They were spying on people, intimidating them, even attacking them. Imagine being a German immigrant. Suddenly, your neighbors are suspicious of you, you're being harassed, called a traitor, just because of where you came from.
It's a reminder that fear and prejudice can happen anywhere, even in a country that's supposed to be about freedom and individual rights. Seems like the war really tested those ideals.
And we're still dealing with that tension today, trying to find the right balance between keeping the country safe and protecting people's freedoms. What happened during World War I, the restrictions they put in place, those things set precedents that are still shaping how we think about government surveillance, free speech, all of that.
It's like the decisions they made back then are still echoing through time, making us ask ourselves how much freedom we're willing to give up for security.
And it's not just about laws and precedents either. The war really changed American culture, how Americans saw themselves and their place in the world.
It's true. The war became part of the American story. The battles, the heroes, the sacrifices, they were all turned into books, movies, even songs. And that shaped how generations of Americans understood their history and their country's role in the world.
Yeah, and it inspired artists too. You had war novels that showed the gritty reality, poems written by soldiers in the trenches, all capturing the horrors and the humanity of it all.
So the war was this huge turning point, politically, socially, and even culturally. It changed how Americans saw themselves, their country, and their place in the world.
Right. It's a good reminder that history isn't just about what happened in the past. It shapes who we are today. Events have ripple effects that touch everything, from politics to art and everything in between.
Well, I think it's safe to say we did a deep dive on this one. From Wilson's struggle to the horrors of the trenches to the changes back home, it's clear that the U.S. entry into World War I was a turning point, not just for America, but for the world.
Definitely. And even though it happened over 100 years ago, what we learned from it, the sacrifices that were made, it's all still relevant today. It reminds us how complex war is, how precious peace is, and how we're still figuring out how to balance individual freedom with national security, even now.
What sticks with you from all this? What questions are you left with? Was it the tough choices leaders like Wilson had to make? The reality of trench warfare we heard about from those who were there? Or maybe it's that struggle between freedom and security that we're still grappling with today. Whatever it is, keep thinking about it, keep asking questions, and keep learning from the past.
Because history isn't just dates and battles, it's about people, about their experiences, the good and the bad. And by understanding the past, we can better understand the world we live in today and maybe even make better choices for the future.